This isn't a story from a movie, this is something that actually happened to me. It's a hard thing to talk about, but it's important that I do, because what was done to me was real, and the way I responded was just as real. The air in the interrogation room was cold and smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a sterile environment so alien to the warm, well-and wood-scented world I had inhabited for 75 years. I sat perfectly still, my back straight, wearing the same tweed suit I wore for client consultations. Across the stainless steel table, Detective Miller, a man whose cheap suit and smug face were an offense to tailoring and decency alike, slid a dark velvet pouch toward me. The gentle clink of metal against the table was deafening in the silence. With a theatrical flourish, he pulled the drawstring. "Recognize this, Arthur," he sneered, his voice a low gravelly thing. He tipped the pouch, and onto the cold steel slid the Patek Philippe Star of Boston, a timepiece so rare it was practically a myth, a watch I had personally serviced for Mr. Abernathy just 6 months prior. My breath caught in my chest. It was then, as I stared at that beautiful, stolen machine, that Miller delivered the line that shattered my world. "We found it in the back of your safe, Arthur," he said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with a greasy, triumphant light. "Right next to the others. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." My life's work wasn't just about keeping time, it was about honoring it. The Finch Son Horology workshop on Charles Street, nestled in the heart of Boston's Beacon Hill, was more than a business. It was a legacy, started by my grandfather, passed to my father, and then to me. For over a century, the name Finch had been synonymous with integrity, precision, and trust. We didn't just fix watches, we were custodians of memories, guardians of heirlooms that marked engagements, retirements, and the passing of generations. My hands, though now wrinkled and spotted with age, knew the soul of a balance wheel, the whisper of a mainspring. My reputation was the only asset I truly valued, forged over 50 years of painstaking, honest work. And in a single sentence, this detective had taken a hammer to it. The accusation was absurd, a physical impossibility. I was Arthur Finch. I didn't steal. The very concept was a violation of my nature. Yet, the watch was there, on the table, a cold, hard fact. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the room's air conditioning, that I was being framed. And I knew exactly who was turning the key. His name was Julian Croft. He had entered my life 3 months earlier, not with the roar of a conquering army, but with the deceptive charm of a viper. He was the managing partner of a private equity firm, Sterling Croft Acquisitions, a company that bought up history and replaced it with glass and steel boxes of profit. They had purchased my building, along with 3 adjacent ones. Croft, dressed in a suit so sharp it could cut glass, had strolled into my workshop one Tuesday morning. The ancient grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10, its deep, resonant tones a stark contrast to Croft's clipped, modern speech. He glided past display cases holding centuries of craftsmanship, his eyes not seeing the art, only the square footage. He offered me a sum to terminate my lease, a lease that was my inheritance, a 99-year document signed by my grandfather, ironclad and secure. The sum was insulting, a fraction of what my location, my legacy, was worth. I politely declined. "Mr. Croft," I had said, my voice calm, "this workshop has been in my family for 3 generations. It is not merely a place of business. It is my home. I will be here until the lease expires, or until I expire." He smiled, a thin, predatory stretching of his lips that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Everything has a price, Mr. Finch," he'd replied, his tone silky smooth. "And every old lock has a key. Or a locksmith." That was the first threat, veiled in the language of business. I hadn't recognized it for the declaration of war that it was. The attack started small, insidious whispers designed to poison the well of my reputation. A week after Croft's visit, Mrs. Gable, a client for 30 years, called in a panic. A diamond chip from the bezel of her heirloom Cartier had gone missing after I'd cleaned it. I was mortified. I searched my workshop for hours, crawling on my hands and knees with a jeweler's loop, my old back screaming in protest. I found nothing. I paid for the replacement out of my own pocket, along with a sincere, humbling apology. 2 weeks later, another client, a prominent lawyer, claimed the timing on his Rolex Submariner was off by 2 minutes a day after a service, a rookie mistake I wouldn't have made even in my apprenticeship. He posted a scathing review online. It was the first negative review Finch and Son had ever received. Each incident was a small cut, insignificant on its own, but together they began to bleed me. I felt a creeping unease, a sense of being watched and manipulated. I started triple-checking my work, documenting every single step with photographs, a paranoid ritual that was entirely new to me. My apprentice, Leo, a good kid with a passion for the craft, saw the toll it was taking. "Arthur, someone's messing with you," he said one afternoon, his young face etched with worry. "This isn't you. You don't make these mistakes." He was right. I was being dismantled, piece by piece, gear by gear, by an invisible hand. I just didn't have the proof. I didn't yet understand that Julian Croft's locksmith was not a man with a set of picks, but one with a badge. The planted watches, the false accusations, the public disgrace, it was all part of his meticulous, brutal design to get my property. He wasn't just trying to evict me, he was trying to erase me. As I sat in that interrogation room, the weight of his ruthlessness pressed down on me. Miller watched me, waiting for me to break, to confess to a crime that was as foreign to me as the dark side of the moon. My mind raced, not with fear, but with a cold, clear logic, the same logic I used to diagnose a broken timepiece. Something was broken here. Terribly broken. And I knew if I didn't find a way to fix it, my time was about to run out. The next 48 hours were a blur of indignity. I was processed, fingerprinted, and photographed. The flash of the camera felt like a physical blow, searing my shame into a permanent record. I, Arthur Finch, whose hands were trusted with the most intricate and valuable timepieces in New England, was now a booking number and a mugshot. My request for a phone call was granted with bureaucratic indifference. I called the only lawyer I knew, a man who drafted my will years ago, not a seasoned criminal attorney. The bail was set at a figure that made me gasp, $250,000. It was a sum clearly designed to be impossible, to ensure I rotted in a cell while the gears of Croft's plan turned. I spent a night in a holding cell at the Nashua Street Jail, the air thick with the smell of despair and human misery. The thin mattress was a world away from my bed, the chorus of shouts and rattling bars a hellish symphony compared to the gentle, orderly ticking of the clocks in my workshop. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the cot, my hands clasped, and I thought. I thought about my father, about his calloused, capable hands teaching me how to handle an escapement fork, his voice explaining the physics of time. "Patience, Arthur," he would always say. "You can't force the pieces. You have to understand them. Listen to them. They will tell you what's wrong." My lawyer, bless his well-meaning but utterly out of his depth heart, managed to get the bail converted to a property bond. I had to sign a lien against my workshop, the very place Croft was trying to steal, to secure my release. Walking out of that jail into the harsh light of day was not a moment of relief. It was a walk of shame. The story had already broken. A reporter from the Boston Globe, likely tipped off by Miller or Croft's PR team, was waiting. The headline the next morning was brutal: esteemed Beacon Hill horologist arrested in high-end watch theft ring. They used my mugshot. My name, the name my grandfather had built from nothing, was now synonymous with crime. My phone began to ring incessantly. Clients, friends, acquaintances, some calling with shock, others with morbid curiosity, and a few with outright accusation. I stopped answering. The trust that had taken a century to build was shattered in a day. The legal battle that followed was a slow, grinding process of attrition. Croft's law firm, a pack of tailored sharks from a skyscraper downtown, filed motion after motion. My simple wool writer was no match for them. They buried us in paperwork, and depositions, and legal maneuvers designed to exhaust my spirit and, more critically, my finances. My life savings, carefully accumulated over decades, evaporated. I sold my father's vintage car. I sold a small collection of antique clocks I had been saving for my retirement. Every dollar went into the gaping maw of the legal system, and it was never enough. Julian Croft, meanwhile, was portrayed as the victim. He gave a statement to the press expressing his deep disappointment and shock. He spoke of the trust he had placed in the tenants of his newly acquired historic properties and how this incident was a stain on the reputation of a great Boston neighborhood. He was the concerned landlord, the civic-minded businessman. Behind the scenes, he was turning the screws. He sent me an official eviction notice, citing a morality clause in the commercial lease that allowed for termination in the event of criminal activity conducted on the premises. The notice was delivered by a sneering courier who practically threw it at my feet. Detective Miller was the prosecution's star witness. His testimony was a masterpiece of fabricated evidence and confident lies. He described a long-term surveillance operation, anonymous tips, a pattern of client complaints. He painted me as a desperate old man, deep in debt, using my workshop as a front to fence stolen luxury goods. It was a fiction, but it was a compelling one. He had falsified logs, created phantom informants, and twisted every innocent detail of my life into something sinister. My meticulous nature became obsessive-compulsive behavior. My solitary habits became antisocial and secretive. My deep knowledge of the luxury watch market became the expertise of a master thief. I watched him on the stand, so comfortable in his deceit, and I felt a helplessness I had never known. The system was on his side. The money, the power, the narrative, it all belonged to them. I was just a broken old man, a relic whose time had passed, being swept away by the ruthless march of progress. I was ostracized. Old friends from the Masonic Lodge would cross the street to avoid me. The owner of the cafe where I'd had breakfast every morning for 40 years suddenly couldn't meet my eye. I was a ghost in my own neighborhood, a pariah on the street that had been my family's home for a century. The weight of it all was crushing. One evening, sitting in my small apartment above the now-shuttered workshop, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, I felt the pull of despair. It was a dark, heavy tide, promising to pull me under, to end the struggle. I was 75 years old. My name was ruined, my savings gone, my life's work ashes. I was facing the very real possibility of dying in prison. Croft and Miller had all the power. They were untouchable, their position secured by wealth and a corrupt system. They had won. It was in that moment, at the absolute nadir of my existence, that I looked up and saw the photograph on my mantelpiece. It was a black and white picture of my father and me, taken in the workshop around 1955. I was a boy of about 5, peering through a loop at a disassembled pocket watch, my small hand guided by his large, steady one. His expression was one of intense concentration and gentle patience. And I heard his voice again, as clearly as if he were in the room. Look closer, Arthur. Don't just see the pieces. See how they connect. Every wheel, every spring, every jewel has a purpose. A clock is a system. Find the flaw in the system. I stared at the photo, at the image of the man who had taught me everything. He wouldn't have despaired. He would have worked the problem. He would have looked closer. A strange calm settled over me, pushing back the tide of despair. Croft and Miller had built a machine to destroy me. It was complex, powerful, and seemingly perfect. But I was a master craftsman. And I knew that every machine, no matter how perfect it seems, has a flaw. A weak gear. A loose spring. A point of vulnerability. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was a fragile old antique to be discarded. They had made a grave miscalculation. They had forgotten that the oldest, most complex machines are often the most resilient. They had forgotten that a watchmaker doesn't just measure time. He understands it. And my time was not over yet. That night, I didn't just decide to fight back. I decided to build a new machine of my own. It would be a machine of perfect, inescapable justice. And I would be its architect. The first step was to accept the new reality. The legal system was not a path to justice, it was a weapon being used against me. My lawyer was a good man, but he was bringing a pocketknife to a gunfight. I couldn't win on their turf, playing by their rules. I had to create a new board entirely. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now became a war room. The walls, once covered in framed horological diagrams, were now papered with notes, timelines, and connection maps. I began to deconstruct the machine that Croft and Miller had built, not with legal arguments, but with the meticulous logic of my craft. I started with the evidence. The watches. According to Miller's report, 6 high-value timepieces had been recovered from my workshop safe. The Star of Boston was the centerpiece, but there were others, a Lang & Son, a Vacheron Constantine, 2 rare Rolexes. All reported stolen from prominent Boston families over the past year. All clients of mine at one point or another. That was the detail that gave their story its veneer of plausibility. I knew the watches were planted. The question was how? And by whom? My safe was an antique marvel, a WF. Carlton with a dual key system and a complex combination lock. Not even Leo knew the full sequence. Only I could open it without triggering a hidden internal mechanism that would seize the bolts. But the police report said there were no signs of forced entry. This meant one of two things: either they had a master safecracker, or someone had given them access. My mind turned to Leo. Could the boy I had mentored, the one I had trusted like a grandson, have betrayed me? The thought was a shard of glass in my gut. But I had to consider it. I had to be cold, methodical. I reviewed the days leading up to my arrest. Leo had been a rock, staying late, trying to help me find the source of the client complaints. He had been as baffled as I was. No, my intuition, the same intuition that could feel a microscopic imperfection in a gear train, told me it wasn't Leo. He was a good kid. This left the other possibility, a bypass. My workshop, like many of the old buildings on Beacon Hill, was a labyrinth of history. My grandfather had always spoken of the old service tunnels that ran beneath the street, passages used for coal and ice delivery a century ago. Most had been sealed off, but the access point in my basement was still there, hidden behind a false wall of shelving. It was a secret I had never shared with anyone. Had they found it? The thought was chilling. It meant they had been inside my space, my sanctuary, violating it long before the police ever arrived. This was not a simple frame-up, it was a meticulously planned operation. Next, I focused on the perpetrators themselves. Julian Croft and Detective Miller. I needed to understand their machinery, find their faulty gears. Croft was the brain, Miller the brawn. I started with Croft. He presented himself as a titan of finance, a visionary reshaping the Boston skyline. I didn't believe it. Men like Croft, all surface and polish, were often hollow inside. I needed to find the rot. The public library became my new workshop. Using their computers, I delved into the world of Sterling Croft acquisitions. I spent hours upon hours reading financial news archives, SEC filings, and real estate journals. At first, all I found was a string of successes. But I kept digging, going back years. And then I found it. A small article in a niche financial blog from 2 years prior. It detailed a massive commercial real estate deal in Atlanta that had gone sour for Sterling Croft. They had over-leveraged, betting on a zoning change that never came. The fund had taken a catastrophic loss. According to the blogger, Croft had only saved his company by securing a last-minute, high-risk infusion of cash from an offshore lender with a notoriously shady reputation. This meant Croft wasn't playing with house money. He was desperate. He was likely in deep debt to dangerous people. The Beacon Hill project wasn't just another deal for him, it was his lifeline. He needed my property, and he needed it fast, to consolidate the parcel and secure the financing for his new skyscraper. My refusal to sell wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to his survival. This was his motive, raw and powerful. Then came Miller. Corrupt cops were a sad, old story. But they always had a weakness. A vice. A reason they were willing to throw away their oath. I couldn't investigate a police detective myself. That would be suicide. I needed help. I swallowed my pride and called the one person who had stood by me without question, Leo. I met him in a quiet corner of the Boston Public Garden, away from listening ears. I saw the worry in his eyes, but also the fierce loyalty. "They're lying, Arthur." "I know they are," he said before I could even begin. I laid it all out for him, my theories about the service tunnel, Croft's financial desperation, and my need to find Miller's weak spot. I gave him a task. "Miller," I said, keeping my voice low. "Find out where he spends his money and his time. Not as a cop, but as a man. Bars, restaurants, hobbies. Be careful. You are invisible. You are just a young man in the city. He will not see you." Leo, to his immense credit, didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, his jaw set. He understood the stakes. While Leo became my eyes and ears on the ground, I turned my attention to the heart of their case, the Star of Boston. That watch was their symbol of my guilt. I would make it the instrument of their destruction. I couldn't get to the watch itself, it was locked away in an evidence locker. But I didn't need to. I had something better, my memory, and my records. In my apartment, I had my grandfather's service ledgers, meticulous, handwritten books detailing every timepiece that had ever passed through our workshop. I found the entry for the Abernathy watch, dated 18 months prior. I had done a full overhaul. I remembered it vividly. It was a stunningly complex piece, a grande complication. As I read my own notes, a memory sparked. A tiny, unique detail. During the service, I had noticed microscopic fracturing on one of the pallet jewels of the escapement, a common issue with a piece of that age. The standard repair would be to replace it. But the original jewel was a specific shade of Burmese ruby that was impossible to match. To preserve the watch's integrity and value, I had done something different. I had developed a proprietary method for reinforcing the jewel with a near-invisible application of a specialized epoxy, strengthened with carbon nanotubes. It was a technique I had pioneered myself. It was undetectable to anyone, even a master watchmaker, without knowing exactly where to look and what to look for. It was my signature, more unique than any engraving. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was still there, hidden deep within the heart of the Star of Boston, waiting. The key wasn't proving I had worked on the watch. It was proving something only I could know about its inner sanctum. My path forward was becoming clearer. The grand machine of my revenge was beginning to take shape. I had identified the flaws in their design, and I had found the tools for my work. All I needed now was patience. And time was something I understood better than anyone. A week later, Leo came to my apartment after dark, his face pale but his eyes burning with excitement. He looked like a conspirator in an old spy movie, nervously checking the empty hallway before slipping inside. He was carrying a plain manila envelope. "Arthur, I think I've got something," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He had spent the last 7 days tailing Miller, a dangerous game for a young man to play. He'd followed him from his precinct in Roxbury to his sad, lonely apartment in Dorchester. He'd watched him drink alone at a dive bar, his face illuminated by the glow of a horse racing channel on the television. And then he hit the jackpot. "He goes to an illegal card game," Leo said, pulling a series of grainy photos from the envelope. "It's in the back room of a social club in the North End. High-stakes poker. I got these from across the street." The photos showed Miller, his face slick with sweat, arguing with a group of dangerous-looking men. He looked cornered, desperate. "He's losing," Leo continued. "Badly. I hung around the bar afterwards, just listening. The word is he's in deep to a loan shark. A guy named Vinnie Gallo. This was it. This was Miller's faulty gear. His gambling addiction. He wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was a desperate one. Croft wasn't just paying him for his services, he was likely bankrolling his addiction or holding his debt over his head. Miller wasn't a partner in this scheme, he was a pawn, a tool being used by a much more powerful player. This made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable. With Miller's weakness identified, I turned my focus back to Croft. His financial desperation was the mainspring driving this whole affair, but I needed more than a 2-year-old blog post. I needed concrete, undeniable proof of his current fraudulent activities, something that would interest parties far more powerful than the Boston PD. I began to map out Sterling Croft's corporate structure, using online resources and business registries. It was a Russian doll of shell corporations and offshore holding companies, designed to obscure ownership and evade taxes. But as complex as it was, it had to have a nexus, a central point where the real money flowed. My research led me to a single, unassuming LLC that was listed as the primary contractor for the demolition and construction permits for the Beacon Hill project. The company, Copley Heritage Development, had a mailing address that was nothing more than a P.O. box at a UPS store in Back Bay. It was a ghost company. But it had to have a bank. And it had to have a signatory. Using a few clever social engineering tricks I'd learned from reading about corporate espionage, it's amazing what you can find out by pretending to be a confused clerical worker from another branch. I managed to identify the bank they were using, a small, exclusive private bank known for its discretion. Getting inside that bank's records was impossible. But I didn't need to. I just needed to rattle the cage. I began to construct an anonymous identity, a disgruntled former employee of Sterling Croft. I bought a cheap, untraceable laptop and a burner phone with cash. Using the library's public Wi-Fi, I created an encrypted email address. My first target was not the police or the FBI, but the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. I drafted a carefully worded tip. It was filled with just enough verifiable information about the Atlanta deal to sound credible, but it also hinted at much larger, ongoing wire fraud and money laundering connected to the Beacon Hill project through the Copley Heritage Development LLC. I didn't provide hard proof. I simply pointed the bloodhounds in the right direction. I sent the email to the SEC's public tip line. Then, I did the same for the IRS. Finally, I sent a similar, slightly altered version to the investigative journalism unit at the Wall Street Journal. I was planting seeds. I knew that federal investigations were slow, grinding affairs. But I wasn't looking for an immediate arrest. I was looking to apply pressure. I wanted to make Croft feel the heat, to make him look over his shoulder, to distract him and perhaps force him into making a mistake. The final piece of my plan was the most delicate. It involved the watch itself, the Star of Boston. My signature, the reinforced palette jewel, was my ace in the hole. But I needed a way to play that card in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible, in open court. My lawyer was preparing for trial, focusing on discrediting Miller and highlighting the lack of forensic evidence. I met with him and gave him a new, very specific instruction. When the prosecution presents the watch as evidence, I told him, I want you to file a motion for an expert examination of the piece, to be conducted right there in the courtroom. He was confused. Arthur, what good will that do? We've already stipulated that you worked on the watch. They'll just say it proves you had access. It's not about access, I replied calmly. It's about integrity. The integrity of the evidence. I am the foremost expert in this city on antique Patek Philippe complications. I want to verify that the piece has not been tampered with while in police custody. It was a long shot, but it was a reasonable request based on the chain of custody. He reluctantly agreed to try. The stage was now being set. The actors were in place. Croft was the arrogant financier, Miller the desperate cop, and I was the wronged old man. But they didn't know my true role. I was not the victim. I was the director. I was the craftsman, and the final, beautiful, and terrible complication of my machine was almost complete. Every gear was meshing, every spring was coiled tight, ready to release at the precise moment. All I had to do was wait for the trial to begin. The ticking of the clock was no longer a sound of dread, but a countdown to retribution. The day the trial began, I walked into the Suffolk County Courthouse not with the shuffling gait of a defeated old man, but with a straight back and a clear purpose. The air was thick with the institutional smell of old paper and floor wax. Reporters swarmed the entrance, a flock of vultures sensing a kill. I ignored their shouted questions and fixed my eyes on the courtroom door. Julian Croft was already there, sitting in the front row of the gallery. He was the picture of confidence, dressed in a bespoke navy suit, whispering to his lawyer with a slight smirk on his face. He caught my eye and gave me a slow, deliberate nod, an unspoken gesture of dominance. He thought this was his victory lap. He had no idea he was a fly walking into a spider's web. Detective Miller took the stand on the second day. He was practiced, calm, and utterly convincing. He laid out the prosecution's case with the authority of his badge, describing the anonymous tip, the weeks of surveillance, and the overwhelming evidence found in my safe. He lied with an ease that was chilling. My lawyer did his best on cross-examination, poking at inconsistencies in the timeline, questioning the existence of the phantom informant. But Miller was a rock. He deflected every question, his answers solid, rehearsed, and unshakable. The jury was captivated. I could see it in their eyes. They saw a decorated police detective telling a straightforward story, and a frail, elderly man who looked like he could be their grandfather, accused of a shocking betrayal. The narrative was powerful. By the end of his testimony, the feeling in the room was grim. My own lawyer looked disheartened. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious woman named Ramirez, called for the primary evidence to be entered. "The prosecution presents People's Exhibit A," she announced, her voice ringing with confidence. An evidence clerk, wearing white gloves, carried a sealed case to the witness stand. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the Star of Boston. It glittered under the courtroom lights, a beacon of beauty and lies. As Ramirez began to describe its significance, its value, and where it was found, my lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense moves for an immediate expert examination of the evidence to verify its integrity and rule out any possibility of tampering while in police custody." Ramirez scoffed. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The chain of custody is pristine." The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Albright, looked down from her bench, intrigued. "On what grounds, counsel?" My lawyer, following my script, replied, "Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Finch, is arguably the world's leading expert on this particular timepiece's movement. He serviced this watch. He has expressed concerns that its delicate internal mechanism may have been damaged or altered. Given the value of the piece and its centrality to this case, a brief, non-invasive examination by the defendant, in full view of the court, is a reasonable request to ensure a fair trial." Judge Albright considered this for a long moment. Croft was now leaning forward, a flicker of irritation on his perfect face. This was not part of his plan. Finally, the judge nodded. "The request is unusual, but I'll allow it. The court will recess for 15 minutes to set up a camera and monitor. Mr. Finch, you will approach the evidence table. You will not touch the piece with your bare hands. You may use your own tools, subject to inspection by the bailiff." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, untimed rhythm. This was it. The mainspring of my entire plan was about to be released. A technician set up a small document camera over the evidence table, its feed displayed on a large screen for the jury and the gallery to see. I approached, my bag of tools in hand. The bailiff inspected them and nodded. I put on a pair of thin latex gloves and my jeweler's loupe. The courtroom was silent, every eye on me. I picked up the watch. It felt cool and familiar in my gloved hand. The camera zoomed in, the image of the watch face filling the screen. I first pointed to the dial. "Your Honor, jury," I began, my voice steady and clear, "this is indeed the Abernathy Patek. You can see the unique patina on the Breguet numerals." Then, I turned the watch over. I took a small, specialized case key from my kit. With the court's permission, I will now open the back of the case to examine the movement. The judge nodded. I carefully twisted the key. There was a soft click, and the engraved gold backing came free. I placed it carefully to the side. The screen behind me filled with a breathtaking sight, the intricate universe of gears, springs, and jewels that was the watch's movement, a symphony of polished metal and shimmering rubies. Even the jury gasped. This, I said, my voice resonating with an authority that came from a lifetime of expertise, is a caliber 89 movement, one of the most complex ever made. I took a fine-tipped brass pointer. The prosecution claims I stole this watch. I claim I am the only man in this room who can identify a unique, microscopic modification I made to this escapement 18 months ago. I directed the pointer to the pallet fork. If the camera will zoom in, please. Right here. The camera operator adjusted the focus, pushing the magnification to its limit. The image on the screen became a landscape of polished steel and ruby. There, I said, my pointer steady. On the edge of the entry pallet jewel. You can see a minuscule line, almost a shadow. That is not a flaw. That is a carbon nanotube reinforced bond one applied to repair a fracture in the original ruby. This technique is my own. It is undocumented. It is my signature. A murmur went through the courtroom. My lawyer was staring, dumbfounded. Ramirez, the prosecutor, looked confused. Croft was now sitting bolt upright, his smirk gone, replaced by a mask of tense concentration. I had their attention. And now, for the masterstroke. It was a gamble, a piece of theatrical horology I had conceived in the darkest hours of my despair. It was based on a single, obscure fact about Miller's personal life that Leo had uncovered just days before the trial began, a detail so small it seemed insignificant, but in my machine, it was the final, critical gear. But this signature is only half of the story, I announced, my voice filling the rapt silence of the courtroom. It proves I worked on the watch. It does not prove I didn't steal it. I saw a flicker of relief on Julian Croft's face. He thought my little trick was over. I then turned my attention to a different part of the movement, to a small, almost invisible bridge near the balance wheel. Antique timepieces like this, from the early 20th century, sometimes used radium-based paint for luminescence. To service them safely, a horologist must be incredibly careful. But over the years, we've developed other, safer techniques. One of them involves using benign, short-lived radioisotopes as tracers and lubricating oils to track wear and dispersal within a complex movement over time. It's a highly specialized diagnostic. I let that sink in. The jury was looking at me, utterly lost but completely mesmerized. Even Judge Albright was leaning forward. 18 months ago, during my service, I applied a single, microscopic drop of a specific isotope, barium-133, to the oil in this particular jewel setting. I indicated the spot with my pointer. It has a half-life of 10 years, but it emits a very low, yet distinct, gamma radiation signature that can be detected with the right equipment. It is, for all intents and purposes, a homing beacon. A way for me to track the health of the watch over time. I paused, then looked directly at Detective Miller, who was sitting at the prosecution's table, his face beginning to pale. The key word, members of the jury, is had. I had applied it. Because, as I can now see under my loupe, the unique oil reservoir for this jewel setting is dry. The tracer I placed there is gone. The prosecutor, Ramirez, jumped to her feet. Objection. Where is this going? The defendant is spinning fantasies. It's going somewhere, counselor. Sit down, the judge snapped, her eyes now fixed on me. Continue, Mr. Finch. I looked from the watch to the jury, my expression somber. This isotope, barium-133, is harmless in this quantity unless one is exposed to it directly. Say, if someone who was not a trained professional, someone not wearing the proper protective gear, handled this movement with their bare hands. If they were to get the oil on their skin, the isotope would be absorbed. It would circulate in their bloodstream for a few days before being harmlessly expelled. Now I turned my gaze back to Miller. His face was ashen. He was starting to understand. It's a funny thing about the human body, I continued, my voice now cold and hard as steel. It concentrates certain elements in certain places. Barium, for instance, behaves like calcium. It has an affinity for bone. If one were exposed, a faint, temporary trace would be detectable in their skeletal system for a short time. It would require a very specific, sensitive medical scan to see it. A scan, for example, like a quantitative bone scintigraphy, a test one might take if they were having, say, unexplained joint pain. I saw Miller's hand tremble where it rested on the table. Leo's last-minute discovery had been a hospital record, obtained through a friend who worked in billing. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. So, it strikes me as a remarkable coincidence, I said, my voice rising, that just 3 days after this watch was allegedly taken into evidence, and 3 days before my arrest, Detective Frank Miller visited the radiology department at Mass General Hospital, complaining of a sore wrist. And it is an even more remarkable coincidence that his physician ordered that exact, highly uncommon scan. The courtroom erupted. Ramirez was shouting objections. Croft shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury and panic. But it was Miller who sealed their fate. His composure finally shattered. He lunged to his feet, his chair screeching back, his eyes wide with animal terror. "He's lying. It's a trick," he screamed, his voice cracking. But his panic was a confession. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. In that moment, the entire case against me disintegrated. But I wasn't finished. This was merely the first part of the machine's work. The second was happening simultaneously, miles away, in the newsrooms and federal offices I had targeted. As Miller was having his meltdown in court, my lawyer's phone vibrated. Then another phone in the gallery buzzed, and another. A news alert had just been pushed to every phone in the city. I could see the headline on the screen of the person in front of me: Wall Street Journal, Boston developer Julian Croft at center of massive SEC fraud investigation. My anonymous tips had borne fruit at the most opportune moment imaginable. The seeds I had planted had bloomed into a forest fire. The story, quoting anonymous but highly credible sources within Sterling Croft, detailed a massive scheme of wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, all centered around the Beacon Hill development project. It mentioned the ghost company, Copley Heritage. It mentioned the shady offshore lenders. It connected Croft's desperate need for the property directly to his criminal enterprise. Croft saw the headlines rippling through the gallery. The color drained from his face. He was no longer a master of the universe. He was just another white-collar criminal, exposed and cornered. His empire of lies had been brought down not by a rival financier, but by an old watchmaker he had underestimated. He looked at me then, across the chaotic courtroom, and in his eyes, I saw pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't see a man who had defended himself. He saw the gear that had jammed his perfect machine, the craftsman who had undone him. Federal agents were waiting for him in the courthouse lobby. His trial was swift. My case was dismissed with a formal apology from the district attorney's office. Detective Miller, facing overwhelming evidence of perjury and evidence tampering, confessed to the entire scheme in exchange for a lighter sentence. He admitted to planting the watches, using a duplicate key to the workshop that Croft had provided after having a locksmith secretly make a copy weeks earlier. It was all over. Just like that. The great, powerful machine they had built was a pile of scrap. Months have passed. The autumn leaves are turning in the public garden, and a familiar chill has returned to the Boston air. My life has found its old rhythm, its steady, comforting tick-tock. Finch Son Horology is open once more. My clients, most of them, have returned, their apologies as sincere as their previous condemnation had been swift. They brought with them not just their watches, but their shame, and I accepted both with quiet grace. The story of my exoneration was as big as the story of my arrest, a sensational tale of a wily old craftsman turning the tables on the rich and corrupt. I became something of a local folk hero, a title I find both amusing and uncomfortable. Leo is no longer my apprentice. I made him my partner. His name is now on the sign beneath mine. His youthful energy and sharp mind have brought a new life to the old workshop. He is the future of this place, the next chapter in its long history. Julian Croft is serving a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for fraud and conspiracy. His empire is gone, his name a disgrace. Detective Miller is in a state prison, stripped of his pension and his honor. Their worlds, once so bright and powerful, have been reduced to the confines of a prison cell. Justice, it seems, is a machine that, while slow, can be brutally precise when properly calibrated. This afternoon, the mail arrived. Among the bills and workshop catalogs was a single, plain envelope with no return address. The postmark was from a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. Inside was a single sheet of cheap, lined paper, covered in a furious, spidery scrawl. It was from Croft. The letter was not an apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a torrent of pure, distilled venom. He blamed me for his downfall, for the ruin of his life. He called me a relic, a stubborn old man who had stood in the way of progress. He promised me that 20 years was not forever. He promised that he would remember me. There were threats, veiled and explicit. It was the hate-filled testament of a man with nothing left to lose but his own rage. I read it once, my face impassive. His words were just noise, the meaningless rattling of a broken machine. They held no power over me anymore. I stood and walked over to my workbench, the heart of my kingdom. The faint scent of oil and brass filled the air, a scent of purpose and order. The gentle chorus of dozens of clocks, all ticking in their own perfect time, was the only sound. I picked up a pair of delicate, German steel tweezers from my tool set. With the precision of a surgeon, I began to fold the letter. I folded it once, then twice, creasing the paper into a tight, perfect square. Each fold was sharp, deliberate. I folded his rage, his threats, his entire worthless being into a tiny, manageable packet. Then, I picked up the small alcohol lamp I use for heating shellac. With a flick of a match, a small, clean blue flame bloomed to life. I held the folded letter with the tweezers, touching one corner to the flame. It caught immediately. I watched the last of his hateful words turn to black ash, the tiny orange flame reflecting in the lenses of my glasses. It curled and vanished into nothing, leaving behind only a wisp of smoke that smelled faintly of bitter ink. Then I extinguished the lamp, and turned back to the intricate marine chronometer on my workbench, whose great, gilded balance wheel had not stopped its steady, patient dance for a single second. The end.